Hi, so I'm Nick Byrd, and today I want to talk about some tests we did of the standard assumptions of reflection tests using Think Aloud protocol analysis with the colleagues here that you see on the screen. So you might be familiar with reflection tests. Here's an example of a verbal reflection test. If you were running a race and you passed the person in second place, what place would you be in now? And the answer that jumps to most people's mind is first place. But if you think about it a little bit more, you might realize that the correct answer is actually second place. So we consider this a reflection test because it lures us into a particular response that, upon reflection, we can realize is incorrect. Now, the standard interpretation of reflection tests has two assumptions. So first, correct responses are considered to involve reflection, and lured responses are considered to lack reflection. But the problem is that there's been some Think Aloud protocol analyses of mathematical reflection tests that violate these assumptions. So our question was, will verbal reflection tests also violate these assumptions? So first we had to get people to complete reflection tests. Then we also had to figure out what the heck they were thinking. So we had them think aloud during the test. That way we could compute not only the standard interpretation of the responses such that correct responses get labeled reflective, but we could also compute a new interpretation based on their Think Aloud reports. This would allow us to sort of calculate the false positives and false negatives of the standard interpretation. And we also needed to analyze the effect of thinking aloud on reflection test performance to see whether our protocol of having them think out loud is actually impacting their performance. So before we get to the details, I just want to cover what I'm calling the two-factor account of reflection. This goes back to Shea and Frith in a paper they wrote in 2016. And the idea corresponds to the history and philosophy of reflective reasoning, in which there's two important factors of reflection, deliberation and conscious reasoning. So the idea is that when we're deliberating, we don't just automatically accept our initial impulse, we kind of stop and reconsider. And the conscious reasoning part just means that we're representing reasons for or against, whatever response we have. We might be double checking our work, for example. So with the Think Aloud recordings that we'll talk about in a moment, we'll be asking questions like, did people verbally reconsider their initial response? Or did they verbalize reasons for or against any particular response? So in the first study, we randomly assigned people to either a Think Aloud condition or a control condition where they could complete the test however they liked. And we aimed for about 50 participants per condition, or 100 people. But this was happening during during spring 2020, so as the pandemic was beginning to shut things down. Fortunately, we were able to get 99 participants before the campus fully shut down, and we had to cease data collection. The people were recruited from a campus, so they're mostly students, but not entirely students, since not everyone on campus is a student. So because some people, usually older people, aren't as familiar with thinking out loud during tests and online surveys like this, we made sure to give them instructions, made sure that they comprehended the instructions, and then we even gave them a practice problem where they would think out loud and sort of practice on that problem before they went into the full survey. And then we had them verbalize their randomly generated 5-digit code so that we could pair their audio recording with their survey responses later on without de-anonymizing their survey responses or their audio recording. So the effect of thinking aloud did not turn out to be significant according to standard significance thresholds. Here you're seeing that lured responses were similar between the Think Aloud and the control condition, and correct responses were similar between the control and Think Aloud conditions. You're also seeing that we tested familiarity. So some participants would say, totally unsolicited, oh, I've seen this question on on TikTok or some other social media platform. And so then we could code that response as a participant who's familiar with these types of questions, and when we ran the analysis, we found that people's unsolicited, self-reported familiarity did predict their test performance. So here it's predicting their lured responses, and here it's predicting their correct responses. And obviously, being familiar with the test seems to help. And we can also ask, when we look at these, listen to these verbal Think Aloud recordings, we can ask whether people verbalized reconsidering their initial response, and or considering reasons for or against any particular response. And what you're seeing here is that the more people did those things, those two things that are considered crucial for reflection, the less likely they were to fall for the lurid response on the test, and the more likely they were to get the answer correct. And this is good. So this means that some standard assumptions about reflection tests and about how reflection works seem to predict reflection test performance. So now we can find out what the Think Aloud recordings revealed about another assumption about whether and how lurid responses are considered during the reflection test. So in line with the default interventionist interpretation, that is, the interpretation according to which we have a default response on a problem and then kind of overcome it through reasoning, according to that interpretation, the best predictor of lurid responses should be having verbally considered the lure. So here we're finding that our data align with that. The more likely someone was to consider the lurid response, the more likely they were to give the lurid response as their final response. But perhaps bad news for the default interventionist interpretation was that considering the lurid answer was actually the best predictor of not answering correctly in both conditions, in part because lots of people who got the answer correct never verbalized or considered the lurid response, even though they're thinking out loud in real time from start to finish, from the moment that they start reading the question to the moment that they're giving their final answer. At no point did they seem to consider the lurid response. The more that people did that, the more likely they were to get the answers correct, meaning that they probably didn't have this default lurid response that they overcame. So recall the standard interpretation of these reflection tests. So correct responses are considered to involve reflection, and lurid responses are supposed to lack reflection. And using our Think Aloud data, we can actually analyze how likely these assumptions are correct in our own data. And what we found is that the false positive rate, that is, correct answers that didn't seem to involve reflection, was about 20%, and the false negative rate, that is, lurid responses that did somehow seem to involve reflection, was about 30%. And so, you could take this as good news or bad news, I guess, depending on your perspective. The negative story would be, it turns out the standard assumptions of reflection tests are often wrong. But the good news would be that the standard assumptions of reflection tests are usually correct. So I'll let you conclude what you will. So the first study that I just went over was run in person, and it took a long time. We recorded each participant one at a time, and we had to kind of recruit people from public settings. It took about a whole semester to get just 100 or 99 participants. So for the second experiment, I decided I would partner with a startup to develop an online survey platform, and this was fantastic. We were able to get about 100 participants, just as many as study one, in an afternoon as opposed to an entire semester. We got automatic transcriptions of their verbal reports, we got automatic sentiment analysis of their verbal reports, and we were able to collect people from not just our local community, but really anywhere that we wanted to, as long as they met our criteria, like being fluent English speakers and things like that. So here's just an overview of all the studies, including that second study that we ran online. The top two graphs here are showing you that the Think Aloud protocol didn't seem to affect reflection test performance, and the bottom two graphs are just showing you that the more likely people were to consciously reconsider or verbally reconsider their initial response, or consciously and verbally articulate reasons for and against a particular response, the more they did those two paradigmatic features of reflection, the more likely they were to do well on a reflection test, which seems to be supporting the standard interpretation of reflection tests. So I'll let you ask questions on this conference's platform however you're supposed to do that, but if that's not a thing, then you can contact me on Facebook or Twitter or on my website. And in case you want to reach out about other work that I've done on reflection, I'm just going to put those pieces up here so you can take a look and contact me, or go to my website. I have my CV on my website. You can find out more about them, find the preprints or the publications if they're already published, or the audio papers if you want to just listen to them as opposed to reading them. Thanks so much for your time.